She looked me dead in the eye and said, "You don't belong at this table." My own daughter-in-law, in front of everyone. My fork shook in my hand, but I said nothing. That was the night I realized I wasn't welcome in the home I helped build. They had forgotten who paid the mortgage when my son lost his job, who watched their kids when they went on vacation. But I remembered, and that night I quietly decided I was taking everything back. When Chelsea first walked into our lives, she had that sweetness that made you feel hopeful. She was polite, always offering to help set the table or bring dessert for Sunday dinners. I remember thinking, maybe Mark chose right after all. She laughed at my stories, called me Dad, and even brought me a cardigan once, saying the house felt too cold for my old bones. It was nice. But I suppose some storms don't come with thunder. They just drift in slowly, like fog. You don't realize how lost you are in it until you can't see anything clearly anymore. After the birth of their second child, things began to shift. Chelsea became efficient. That's the only word I can think of now. She reorganized the kitchen, said my late wife's layout was outdated. She took down the photo of our wedding that hung near the dining room, replacing it with some abstract art she said fit the aesthetic. I asked about it once, gently. She smiled and said, "It's time to modernize, Dad." She always used that word, modernize, as if love had an expiration date. Then came the smaller things, or maybe they only seemed small at first. She told the children not to disturb me while I was reading, framing it as giving Grandpa his quiet time, when really, it was just another way to isolate me. Friends from my old school days would stop by occasionally. We'd sit on the porch, talk about the students we missed, the ones we didn't. But slowly, Chelsea started making those visits feel uncomfortable. She'd hover near the door, check her watch, offer awkward smiles that made it clear we were overstaying. Mark, my son, he just kept his head down. I'd catch his eyes sometimes during these moments, hoping to find that boy I raised, the one who once brought me coffee when I was grading late into the night, who built me a birdhouse in 8th grade with a crooked roof and too many nails. But that boy, he looked away. One morning, I found my recliner, the one my wife had gifted me on our 30th anniversary, moved out to the garage. No explanation, just gone from the living room as if I had never belonged there. I asked Chelsea, and she laughed, said, "Oh, we needed the space. It didn't really fit anymore." Didn't fit. It wasn't just the chair. Soon, I didn't fit at the dinner conversations either. They talked about work trips, school fundraisers, new home decor ideas. I tried to join in once, mentioned a student I used to teach who'd become a city council member. Chelsea blinked and said, "That's nice, but we're talking about something else right now." I looked at Mark. He just took another bite. I began eating most of my meals in my room after that. And it wasn't like I didn't try. I offered to help with the kids read bedtime stories, pick them up from school. But I was often told they already had a routine. When I brought home a board game I used to play with Mark, Chelsea said it had too many small parts and quietly placed it on the top shelf, out of reach. Like me. I suppose the moment I truly felt the shift, the moment I realized I wasn't just being ignored, but slowly erased, was the day Chelsea stood in the hallway, hands on hips, and asked me not to wear my slippers in the kitchen. "They track in dirt," she said. I looked down at those worn brown slippers, the ones my wife had sewn a patch onto when the heels split, and I realized something. I was the dirt. I went back to my room that evening and sat in the dark for a long time. It's a strange thing to be made to feel invisible in the very space you once called home. To walk the halls you painted, step on the tiles you installed with your bare hands, only to hear someone say, "Your presence is inconvenient." It doesn't come like a lightning strike. It comes like water dripping slowly on stone, unnoticed until you're carved hollow. And through all of it, I said nothing. Because part of me still hoped that kindness would win, that silence would earn respect, that maybe, just maybe, the family I gave everything for would remember the man behind the walls. They didn't, but I did. There's a certain kind of silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from being overlooked, forgotten. I used to think silence was strength, that enduring without complaint made you noble. But now I wonder if it just makes you invisible. After Chelsea took over our house, I started pulling away quietly. But even as I disappeared from their attention, I was still holding everything together behind the scenes. Mark lost his job a few years back. I didn't tell anyone, but I sold my old Buick to help them catch up on mortgage payments. It was a 2077 Electra, sky blue, the last car my wife ever rode in. I remember driving her to chemo in that car, watching her fingers curl against the seatbelt as we waited for test results. After she passed, I kept it clean, filled the tank every month, even when I didn't drive. I used to sit in it some nights, just to feel closer to her. When I handed the keys to a collector who paid me $12,000 cash, I didn't feel proud. I felt hollow. But I gave the money to Mark and told him it came from an old retirement fund. I didn't want them to feel guilty. I just wanted them to stay afloat. Then came the medical bills, not mine, theirs. Pediatric dental work, allergy tests, Chelsea's prescription for her back. I dipped into my own savings, the little I had left from my pension. There were months when I skipped my blood pressure meds because I didn't want to add to the grocery list. I canceled my annual physical last year. Didn't even tell my doctor. I told myself it wasn't urgent. Truth was, I couldn't stand the idea of them seeing another bill with my name on it. When they went to Hawaii last spring, a surprise trip Chelsea planned for the kids, I stayed home with the dogs. I fed them, walked them, cleaned up their messes. I remember sitting on the couch one evening, looking at a photo Chelsea had printed for the fridge, her and the kids under a palm tree, all sun and smiles. I wasn't angry, just absent. And still, I never asked for thanks. Not once. I was the one who fixed the leaky sink in the guest bathroom at 2 a.m. I was the one who cleared snow from the driveway before Mark's interviews. I was the one who watched their youngest when the nanny quit, holding that little boy against my chest while he cried for his mother. But those moments don't go on Instagram. They don't make it into family albums. They live in quiet corners, in unspoken efforts, in unsent receipts. Sometimes I'd pull out the journal I kept. It started as a way to talk to my wife after she passed. Letters to the woman who once held this family together, with nothing but love and warm hands. I'd write things like, "Mark's worried again. I wish you were here to talk him down." Or, "Chelsea reorganized the pantry. She says the old ways are cluttered." Small things, honest things. But as the months passed, the entries changed. They don't see me anymore. I miss being called by my name. Today, I realized I haven't been hugged in over a year. It's strange. Writing to someone who's gone. You begin to realize how much of your voice you've buried just to keep the world from cracking. But a man can only carry so much weight before even his silence becomes heavy. There was one evening that stays with me. I found an old photo album while cleaning out the hall closet. Inside was a picture of Mark when he was 9, sitting on my shoulders, both of us covered in paint from when we built the treehouse out back. His smile was wide, his arms out like wings. That treehouse is gone now. Torn down when they installed the trampoline. I stared at that photo for a long time. Not because I missed the treehouse, but because I missed the boy who once looked up to me. The one who trusted me with his laughter. Now, he barely made eye contact. And yet, I kept giving. I kept sacrificing. Because love doesn't come with ledgers. It doesn't demand repayment. It only asks to be remembered. But I was beginning to realize they had forgotten. They had forgotten the father, who stayed up all night sewing patches on soccer jerseys. The man who worked 2 extra years just to pay for Mark's out-of-state tuition. The husband who kept the light on every night until his wife came home from her evening shifts. They saw me now as a fixture. An old man in the hallway, a quiet shadow. But I was more than that. And deep down, I was starting to remember it too. It was the day she asked me to knock, before entering my own kitchen. That morning, I'd gotten up early, the way I always do, and shuffled in quietly to make coffee. I'd barely touched the cabinet door when Chelsea came around the corner, half awake, her robe tight around her waist. She gave me that look, not angry, not rude, just cold. Like I was a guest who'd overstayed. "Next time, can you knock first?" she said, her voice flat. "We're trying to keep the mornings calmer for the kids." I stood there for a second, my hand still on the cabinet, the smell of the beans not even brewing yet. Then I nodded. I didn't say a word, but something inside me did. That was the moment it changed, not with shouting, not with any great insult, just a door I was told to knock on in the house I built with my own hands. Later that day, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Daniel Mendez. He used to be a student of mine back in 2092. Quiet kid, brilliant. He once gave me a thank you note after graduation that said, "You're the first adult who made me feel smart." He's a real estate attorney now, has an office over on Blanco Road. When I called, he picked up in 2 rings. "Mr. Bennett?" he said, surprised. "You still remember me?" I asked. "You changed my life." I never forgot. I didn't tell him everything on the phone, just said I needed to ask about a house, about ownership, legality, and protection of assets. He offered to meet me for coffee that same afternoon. We sat at a little cafe just off the loop. I ordered black coffee. He ordered something with oat milk and cinnamon. The world had changed, I thought, and yet here we were, teacher and student, now reversed in roles. I slid him the old paperwork, the deed, the tax records, the will my wife and I had signed in 2006. He leafed through them with a lawyer's eye, quiet and deliberate. When he was done, he looked up. "Mr. Bennett, this house is entirely in your name. You never transferred it." I stared at him. Not because I didn't believe it, but because I'd forgotten it. For so long, I'd been living like a guest that I had stopped remembering I was the owner. The foundation, the roof, the mortgage, every piece of paper still said my name. "And if someone's trying to make you feel otherwise," Daniel added gently, "you have every legal right to reclaim your space. You're not a burden. You're the landlord." That word, landlord, felt foreign, heavy. I didn't like it. I sipped my coffee and looked out the window. A father and daughter walked by, holding hands. The little girl had a balloon tied to her wrist. I thought about Mark at that age, how he used to grab my hand tight whenever we crossed the street, trusting that I'd never let go. Somewhere along the way, he let go first. Daniel was still talking, offering advice about legal notices, eviction options, timelines. But I wasn't listening to the legal language. I was listening to something quieter, something older. A voice in my own chest whispering, "You still matter." For the first time in years, I walked out of a conversation feeling tall. Not angry, not empowered, just clear. Clear that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't being petty, that I hadn't imagined the disrespect. Clear that the home I once built with calloused hands and late-night prayers didn't suddenly belong to someone else just because I stopped speaking. I walked home slower than usual that day. As I passed the old elementary school, I thought of the hundreds of students I'd taught, the lives I'd shaped, the families I'd helped. I thought of my wife, her apron still hanging in the pantry, untouched. And I thought about how quietly dignity can slip through the cracks if we're not paying attention. But not this time. This time, I had the papers, I had the truth, and more than anything, I had a decision to make. Chelsea said we should have a family dinner that night. She'd made lasagna, her version, with goat cheese and spinach instead of the simple beef and ricotta my wife used to make. I said nothing, as usual, just pulled my chair back an inch farther from the table and folded my hands. The kids were already seated, their faces glued to tablets until Chelsea barked for them to put them away. Mark was on his phone. He barely looked up when I walked in. I cleared my throat, just enough to announce my presence, and sat down at the far end of the table, not at the head. That seat had quietly become Chelsea's over the past year. We started eating. Conversations drifted around me. Work stories, home renovations, a planned ski trip I hadn't heard about. I picked at my plate, the goat cheese sticking to the roof of my mouth. I used to love dinners. We used to pray before meals. We used to laugh. Now, I watched as everyone ate while I sat in the past. At some point, Mark mentioned that his boss had complimented one of his presentation slides. Chelsea smiled, proud. That was my moment. I tried, just once, to join in. I smiled and said, "Reminds me of a student I had used to draw comics on his homework. Ended up becoming a graphic designer. Sometimes it's those small sparks you don't expect." It was meant to connect, to show I was still part of the world they lived in, still breathing, still watching. Chelsea looked at me and laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, just enough to cut through the air. "That's nice, Dad," she said. "But we're not talking about old school stories right now." The words didn't hit me like a slap. They fell like dust, quiet, heavy, impossible to brush off. The table went quiet for a second, and then Mark picked up the thread again, as if nothing happened. But something had. I sat back in my chair. I didn't touch my food again. My hands trembled just slightly, not from age, not from illness, from the deep, familiar ache of being unwanted. And then it happened. Chelsea turned toward me, her fork halfway to her mouth, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Honestly, you don't even seem like you want to be here most of the time." Then, she smiled, added casually, "Maybe it's time you started eating in your room again if that's more comfortable for you." My grandson blinked. My granddaughter looked down. "Mark?" He stayed silent. I didn't speak. Not a word. I just stood up slowly, folded my napkin with deliberate care, and placed it on the edge of my plate. My knees cracked as I pushed back my chair. I walked to the kitchen, poured the rest of my water into the sink, and rinsed the glass. Then I went to my room. I didn't cry. I didn't write. I didn't pray. I just sat on the edge of my bed, shoes still on, and stared at the floorboards. My wife once told me that dignity isn't something others can give you. It's something you have to decide to keep, especially when others try to strip it away. But that night, I felt like a man with nothing left to keep. I felt like a coat left on a hanger, present, but forgotten, necessary in winter, but invisible in spring. And the worst part wasn't what Chelsea said. It wasn't even what Mark didn't say. It was that it wasn't the first time I felt that way. It was just the first time I knew I couldn't do it anymore. I looked around my room, the only space in the house that still felt remotely mine. The bookshelf, the faded curtains, the small photo of my wife in her blue dress, framed and chipped at the corner. I whispered to her, "Did I fail them? Or did they fail me?" She didn't answer, of course. But the silence that followed was louder than any reply I could have imagined. That night, I didn't just feel broken. I felt gone. Have you ever been silenced in your own home? Please tell me your story below. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in bed, shoes still on, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter from the living room. They were watching a movie, some loud action thing, with car chases and explosions. The same one Mark and I watched together years ago, when his mother had gone to visit her sister. Back when he used to pull his chair close to mine and ask questions like a little boy still curious about the world. Now, they laughed without me. And maybe that was the part that hurt most, not the exclusion, but how normal it had become. At dawn, I got up, didn't make coffee, didn't check the thermostat. I just put on a clean shirt, slipped on my jacket, and walked out the front door without saying a word. The air was cool, that in-between hour where the world hasn't yet decided if it's night or morning. I walked slowly. My knees ached more than usual, but I welcomed it. Pain reminded me I still had a body, still had a life. I passed the school first, the one where I taught for 38 years. The building had changed. New paint, new playground, a steel fence where a chain-link one used to stand, but my name was still etched into the cornerstone plaque. Principal George Bennett, 1980 2004. Funny how stone remembers better than people. I kept walking, past the donut shop where Mark and I used to go every Saturday after Little League. They'd already opened. I didn't go in. Eventually, I ended up at the park. There was a bench near the duck pond, our bench. My wife used to bring breadcrumbs and feed the ducks while I read the newspaper beside her. She'd talk about everything and nothing. Her voice was my favorite background noise. I sat down slowly. The ducks were still there. I pulled out my journal. Pages curled from age and use. I flipped to the last thing I'd written. I was humiliated tonight. Again. And then I stopped. For the first time in months, maybe years, I didn't write another complaint. I didn't pour sorrow onto paper. I just stared at the empty line below it and then shut the journal. I looked at the trees. Their leaves were starting to change, turning orange, brown, curling at the edges. They didn't fight the season. They just let go when it was time. I'd been holding on. To history. To memory. To the belief that one more act of silence, one more sacrifice, would bring my son back to me. But all I'd done was teach them to stop hearing me. They didn't forget me overnight. I let them forget me slowly. It wasn't rage that settled in me that morning. It was something quieter, firmer, like a post finally being hammered into the ground after leaning too long. When I got home, I made coffee. Just one cup. I sat at the kitchen table, the same place Chelsea said I didn't belong, and I wrote a letter. Not an angry one. Not poetic or dramatic. Just clear. I told them I needed my space back. That I was reclaiming my home. That they had 30 days to find a new arrangement. I didn't blame. I didn't scold. I just stated the truth. At the bottom, I wrote something I hadn't said in years. I still love you. But I love myself now too. I folded the letter neatly and placed it on the kitchen counter. And then, I waited. Not for an explosion. Not for an apology. But for the sound of my own footsteps as I walked back to my room, stood at the window, and realized for the first time in a very long time that I was no longer afraid. It didn't take long. By noon, the house was louder than it had been in months. I was in my room reading an old Western novel when I heard the sharp clack of heels on the kitchen tile, followed by the unmistakable slap of paper being snatched off the counter. Silence. Then a voice tight, high-pitched, trying to stay calm but already boiling. What is this? I didn't answer right away. I closed the book gently, marked the page with a receipt, and stood up slow. My bones ached, but I moved like I had purpose, like I wasn't afraid anymore. When I walked into the kitchen, Chelsea was holding the letter in both hands, eyes scanning the words again, as if she hadn't read them correctly the first time. Mark stood behind her, confused, not angry, just lost, like a man who missed the moment his foundation cracked and now stood in the rubble, wondering when the house fell. "You can't be serious," Chelsea said. I looked at her, not with spite, not with anger, just the same quiet gaze I'd used as a teacher when a student tried to challenge the rules, not to punish, but to make them understand the boundary was real. "I'm serious," I said. 30 days, that's plenty of time." She stared at me like I was someone new, or maybe someone she had never really known in the first place. Mark stepped forward. "Dad, why would you do this?" And that question made something inside me tremble. Because he truly didn't know, or didn't want to. Both were heartbreaking. "Because I've been invisible in this house for too long," I said. "And I won't be erased in the place your mother and I built." Chelsea laughed. A sharp, bitter sound. "This is about pride. About some chair and some lasagna and—" "No," I interrupted. Calm, steady. "This is about respect. And you stopped showing it a long time ago." She opened her mouth to argue, but I turned to Mark. "I raised you better," I said. "You watched me take care of your mother until her last breath. You saw me fix every broken pipe, pay every late bill, and never once ask for applause. But now, I knock before entering my own kitchen. I eat alone in the room your mother died in. And I watch my grandson look at me like I'm furniture." He didn't speak. His face was pale. Chelsea tried again. You're going to throw your family out? Over what, your feelings? No, I said quietly. Over the truth. The kids came down the hallway just then, sensing the tension. I smiled at them gently, told them everything was fine, told them to go play in the backyard. Chelsea looked like she might protest, but even she knew better than to argue in front of them now. She stormed off to the bedroom. Mark stood there, helpless. We don't have the money to move out, he said softly. I nodded. Then you'll need to find a way, just like I did when I had nothing but your mother's smile and a bag of tools. He looked away, his eyes blinking fast. He wanted to speak, maybe scream, maybe plead, but all he said was, "You really mean this?" I stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. It shook beneath my touch. Yes, I do. That night, the house was quiet. Not heavy, not angry, just still. I sat at the table and drank a full cup of coffee for the first time in weeks. Nobody told me to be quiet. Nobody asked me to leave. Nobody looked past me. I was alone, but I wasn't erased. And I finally understood something. Sometimes, reclaiming your place in the world doesn't require shouting or fighting. It just requires saying no to being made small. Would you have written that letter? Or kept the peace a little longer? Let me know below. They didn't speak to me for days. Not a word, not a glance, not even the usual forced pleasantries. I'd pass Chelsea in the hallway, and she'd turn her face to the wall like I was smoke. The kids were confused. You could see it in the way they whispered around corners, tiptoed into the kitchen, glanced between their parents and me like they were trying to solve a riddle no one would explain. Mark, he wore silence like a man wears a borrowed coat, ill-fitting, uncomfortable. Every now and then, he'd open his mouth like he was about to say something, then close it and walk away. Sometimes I'd catch him standing in the garage, just staring at the wall where my old tools used to hang. The wall he once painted with me when he was only 10. The packing started quietly. First, a few boxes in the living room. Then the garage was cleared. Chelsea did most of it. Efficient as ever, like she was organizing a business merger rather than moving out of the home I let her live in rent-free for 6 years. She didn't ask for help, didn't say thank you, didn't even ask for an extension. She was furious, but she was too proud to show it outright. Mark started sleeping on the couch. I could hear their arguments at night, muffled, tense. Words like betrayal, selfish, and he's old and stubborn floated up through the vents like smoke. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, wondering how we'd come to this. Wondering when the son I raised stopped seeing me as his father and started seeing me as an obstacle. A week before they left, my granddaughter knocked on my door. She held a drawing, me, her, and a big sun in the corner. I was smiling in the picture. She said, "I don't want to go." I didn't know what to say. So I knelt down, hugged her tight, and said, "You'll always have a place in my heart, no matter where you live." She cried, quietly, the way children do when they don't fully understand why their world is changing, only that it's about to. On the day they moved out, the house buzzed with activity. Movers came, boxes were labeled and taped shut. The kids clung to their toys. Chelsea barked instructions like a general. Mark didn't look at me once. I stood by the front door, arms crossed, watching the home I once filled with laughter and bedtime stories become a place of tension and transition. No one said goodbye. Not Chelsea. Not even Mark. Only the kids, a quick hug, a little wave from the car window. Then they were gone. Just like that. The door closed behind them with a soft thud, and for the first time in years, I heard my house breathe. The silence wasn't empty. It was sacred. I walked through the rooms slowly. The living room looked larger without their things. The hallway echoed again. I ran my fingers along the kitchen counter where I'd left the letter, the same place Chelsea once told me not to walk without slippers. Everything looked the same, but it all felt different. Around sunset, I stepped out onto the porch. Saturday, in the old rocking chair, I'd moved back to its rightful spot. The wood creaked beneath me, familiar, faithful. The sky was painted in burnt orange, like the brushstrokes of a god who knew how to end a chapter. That's when I heard footsteps. It was my neighbor, Maria. She was carrying a bowl of caldo and a soft smile. I heard they moved, she said gently. I nodded. Good, she said. It's about time you stood up for yourself. I didn't answer. Just took the bowl, nodded again, and let the steam rise into the evening air. Because she was right. It was time. The next morning, I woke up to silence. But not the cold, stifling silence I'd grown used to, the kind that settles between people who no longer speak, no longer see. This silence was soft, kind, like the house itself had exhaled. For the first time in years, I brewed my coffee without feeling like I had to tiptoe. The mug clinked gently on the counter. I opened the windows wide, let in the breeze, let the light touch the walls that had spent too long in the shadows. I sat at the kitchen table alone and read the newspaper cover to cover. No one rushed me. No one sighed at the sound of my spoon against the bowl. It was quiet, but I wasn't lonely. There was a peace in knowing I could move through my home without apology. I didn't have to ask where my things were. I didn't have to knock. I didn't have to pretend. I started reclaiming small pieces of myself. I brought my recliner back into the living room, the one Chelsea had banished to the garage. I wiped it down, ran my fingers along the worn leather, and placed it right where it used to be. It creaked when I sat, but it still fit me perfectly. I dusted off old photo albums and left them on the coffee table like they used to be, not hidden away, not boxed up. I found my wife's apron in the pantry, folded and slightly yellowed with age. I hung it back on the wall hook, right where she always kept it. Not because I was clinging to the past, but because it was ours. The evenings became my favorite time. I'd sit on the porch again, just like we used to. Watch the sun dip behind the rooftops, feel the breeze roll in over the street. Neighbors waved more often now. Some of them even stopped to talk, to ask how I was, to say they'd missed seeing me out front. It surprised me how many people noticed my absence. One neighbor, Thomas, brought over a slice of pecan pie. House feels more like yours again, he said with a grin. About time. I nodded and smiled. But inside, something ached. Not regret, not doubt, just the echo of a life I thought I'd keep until the end, a shared home, a family that stayed close, the joy of growing old with loved ones nearby. But sometimes, you protect your peace by letting go of what no longer protects you. I still miss the kids, their laughter, their small footsteps across the hardwood floors, the way they used to ask me to read one more page, one more story. I missed their innocence, their natural ability to love without conditions. But I didn't miss the tension. I didn't miss the way I felt reduced like a figure in the background of a painting no one stopped to admire. Now, I moved slowly, but with purpose. I cleaned the garden. I fixed the broken fence. I replaced the porch light. Every nail I hammered, every weed I pulled, it felt like stitching my dignity back together. I didn't need applause. I just needed to feel human again. Alive. Present. One afternoon, I found myself humming in the kitchen, a song my wife used to sing while cooking, nothing fancy, just a melody woven from memory. I caught myself halfway through, paused, smiled. She would have liked this version of me. Not the man who went quiet to keep the peace, but the one who finally stood tall again. The one who remembered his own name. Do you think peace sometimes comes after we let go? I'd love to hear your thoughts below. It had been 3 weeks since they left. The house had settled into its own rhythm, quiet mornings, long walks, soft jazz on the old radio. I started cooking again. Simple meals, nothing fancy. But I took my time. I stirred slowly. I seasoned with care. I even bought a pie crust, just to see if I still remembered how to bake. I did. The silence no longer felt like an absence. It felt like a choice. Then one Thursday evening, Just as the sun had finished bleeding into the horizon, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I peeked through the curtain. It was Mark. Alone. No kids. No Chelsea. Just him, standing beside his car with both hands in his jacket pockets, eyes scanning the porch like it held the answer to a question he hadn't dared ask. He looked older, tired, not just from work or fatherhood, but from the kind of heaviness a man carries when he realizes he might have broken something he can't easily fix. I stepped outside, didn't say anything, just opened the screen door and waited. He took 2 steps forward, stopped, looked at the ground. "I didn't know how bad it had gotten," he said softly. "I didn't see it." I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because some truths don't need echoing. They just need to settle. "Chelsea," he started, then stopped. Things weren't right between us. I see that now, but I let it get too far. I let her speak for all of us." He paused, looked up. "You were right." That sentence, those 3 words, hit harder than any insult ever could, because I never needed to win. I just needed to be seen, to be heard. Mark's voice cracked. "Dad, I'm sorry." I walked down the steps slowly, until I was standing a few feet from him. He looked like he expected a lecture, or, worse, silence. But I surprised him. I reached out, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "It hurts, son, but I'm still here." He nodded, blinking fast. His eyes were red, and for a moment I saw that little boy again. The one who ran to me after falling off his bike. The one who cried into my chest when his dog died. The one who used to say, "Don't worry, Dad. I'll always be on your team." Maybe life had twisted us, but under all that distance, he was still mine. We sat on the porch, side by side. No raised voices, no digging through blame, just silence. Shared silence. The good kind. Eventually he asked if we could talk more. Not tonight, not right away, but soon. I told him the porch light would be on. He smiled. A small one, but real. Then he left. And I stood there a while, watching his car disappear down the street. I turned to the porch, switched on the light, let it spill across the steps. Not as a welcome, not as a condition, but as a promise. A quiet one.